Hello, this is Jim McKeeth, Lead Developer Evangelist and Engineer for Embarcadero Technologies, and welcome to this developer skill sprint on saving and retrieving settings using SaveState. This is our Tuesday skill sprint, which is going to be using Delphi or Object Pascal. If you want to see C++, come back in 2 days on Thursday, and you'll see the C++ version of this skill sprint. But what I'm going to show you here, the SaveStates, works across all platforms, Windows, OS X, Android, and iOS. It works with RAD Studio, Delphi, and C++. The examples will be in Delphi, but this also works in C++. If you are new to Delphi or C++ and you want some more information, those general information links there provide some great information. Links to doc wikis, our getting started pages, as well as skill sprints can be found there. Our agenda, we're going to first introduce you to SaveState, talk about the persistence versus transient options, the way some of the different platforms behave a little differently, and then some usage considerations, and then have a link to a great class helper. So the purpose behind SaveState is that on mobile devices, the background apps sometimes can be terminated from memory. So what that means is if you're using an app and you switch from that app to another app, that app's still there in memory and the state's maintained automatically because it's in memory. But sometimes it'll get pushed out because of another app needing more memory. That's just the way the mobile apps work, the mobile OS works. When that happens, an event fires that gives your app an opportunity to save the state so that when the app's launched again, the state can be restored. So this makes it easier to persist the data in your forms or anything else that you want to persist that would set the state up of that application. By default, it saves it in transient or temporary storage so that it's not permanent storage. For example, if the device reboots or if the device runs out of hard drive space, it could clean up the temporary storage, or if they run some sort of cleaner application, it could clean up this temporary storage. So there's a number of situations that could result in the storage being cleaned up. For example, on iOS, if they back up their device and restore it, it may not be restored in that situation. But you do also have the option to save the state to persistent storage, which can be useful as well. So this is all done through the TFormSaveState class. All FireMonkey TForms and TForm3Ds have a property called SaveState, and this is an instance of the TFormSaveState. And then they have an event called OnSaveState. So in the OnSaveState event is when you access the SaveState property and you persist any settings you want to persist to the stream. So SaveState.stream is a memory stream that you can use to load and save settings from. If you want to change it from the transient storage, the temporary storage, to permanent storage, then you can modify the storage path. So make sure you modify the storage path before you read from it. And keep in mind that if you previously persisted it to the transient storage and you change the storage path, now you'll be reading from the non-transient storage, which means you won't be reading your previous state. So keep that in mind. Also, you can change the name, and you can actually change the name in order to have multiple values written to the storage. So if you want to store maybe the form in one place and then you want to store some other data in another place, you can activate that by just switching names. So you switch to the default name or the name of your other settings you want to persist. So there's some slightly different platform behaviors for this. And the different behaviors really come down to the behavior when you're using the transient state storage, which is the default storage state if you're not specifying a path. Okay. On Android, the transient storage or this transient state is stored in the native activity. And the native activity discards that if the app is terminated manually. So if you manually swipe the app to terminate it, then it discards that. And that's the way the OS institutes this behavior. So the way you can test this is under developer options. You can set it to don't keep activities. And that way, as soon as you switch away from the activity, switch away from your app, the activity gets pushed out of memory, just as if it was pushed out in the background. On iOS, Windows, and OS X, it still persists the state when the app is manually terminated. So it's much easier to test, and it will by default, as soon as you close the app and relaunch it, it's saved and restored the state if you've set up on SaveState. On Windows and OS X, The default location is the temp folder. Okay, this is a shared temp folder that all apps can access. And so potentially you could have another app accessing your save state. So keep that in mind for security purposes. Or another app could stomp on your save state. So definitely something to consider if you're storing it in the transient location, the default location. Now, if you change the storage path to, say, documents folder or home folder or something like that, then this behaves the same across all of these. Okay, so really the difference is how it's being stored, where the storage path is on the different platforms because of the variations in the OS and how that behaves based on that platform. So let's take a look at save state in action. The great thing about FireMonkey is I can develop this and prototype this on Windows, and then it'll work across all platforms. So that's what I'm going to do right now. We're going to demonstrate this on Windows, and then when we're all done, I'll show you how it works on other platforms, and I'll explain the other differences as we go along. So this is a simple application here. I'm going to run it. Like any application, you enter data on it. So actually, I'll just use this button here. Put some random data in here for me, and I'll put a little hello world. We close it and relaunch it. All data's gone. Okay, that's what we're used to. On Windows, it's not a big deal because you've put a Windows application in the background and go to other applications. Windows is never going to put it out of memory. Okay, on iOS and Android, on the other hand, that happens quite frequently. It seems like, for me at least. But the application gets pushed out of memory because that's the way the Android OS works and the iOS OS works. Is that when the memory is needed by a foreground application, it pushes the background applications, the oldest background applications, out. It has some formulas it uses to determine what's going to happen. So how do we fix this? How do we deal with this so that our users don't have to keep re-entering their data or don't lose their state or their place inside your application? That's where SaveState comes in. So on the form, we have an event, a new event here called OnSaveState. Now I've already got an event handler in here for me. That's what it's going to do is going to clear the save state stream. So save state is the new property that all TForms and TForm 3Ds on the FireMonkey side have. And this is where you can persist the state. So you always want to clear the stream first, because if you don't, if the stream already had data in it and you just write more data, your stream is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and you only ever read the original data out, and that's just a mess. So clear your stream before writing to it. Then we're going to create a binary writer here, pointing it to the stream, and we write in the data we want to store. So in this case, I'm writing in the edit, the memo, edit, edit. Okay? Now, on create, we're going to do the reverse, essentially. First, we're going to check to see if the stream has a value in it. If it doesn't, we don't need to do anything. And I'm adding a little label here just for my information purposes. In a production app, you probably wouldn't need to do this, but this is basically how you would determine if you're restoring from a save state or not. Okay, so then we create a T-binary reader, point it to the stream, and we read these values back out. Now, it's very important that I read them out in the same order I wrote them. Otherwise, we'll get an error message because it's reading it from the stream. And so if I tried to, let's say I wrote an integer in there. So let me show you here. These write method has a lot of overrides. So there's lots of different options for what you want to write here. If you wrote a single and then tried to read it out as a string, you would get an error message. Okay. So it's important that you keep these in the same order on both sides. And then when you make changes to them, don't rearrange them orders in future versions. Otherwise, you'll have problems. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this now. And we'll put some random data in here, and I'll include a hello world. Then we close it, reopen it, and look at that. All of our data is still there. Okay, so this is the low-level use case. If you're going to be typically wanting to persist all the fields on your form, you can do that. Actually, I'll show you the helper here. First thing, before I do that though, a couple things. Right here is where you can change the storage path. I'm not doing that. You can change it to the home path, and that would store it inside your home path, which for Windows, you can look at the documentation. It's like the app data folder or something like that. So this way it will make it permanent instead of transient. So if it's in the temp folder, it can get wiped away by a cleanup process on the OS, for example, or on mobile devices on reboot or different things like that could cause the temp directory folder to be cleaned up. You can also change the SaveState.name, and like I said, that allows you to store multiple types of data, multiple data bundles in there, if you will. If you want to have a better understanding about how SaveState works, the SaveState, if you go to here, it's defined in FMX forms, but you want to dig into the FMX platform defines the SaveState service, which is then implemented for Mac, iOS, Windows, and Android. So if you come in here and look, you can see that when the storage path is empty, on Mac it gets temp path, on iOS it gets the temp path, on Windows it gets the temp path, and then on Android, this is where we have that slightly different behavior, the transient state is in the native activity, okay? So the activity in Android OS maintains that for us. So if you don't specify a storage path, it's just going to put it into the activity, and then the activity keeps it. That's why on Android, if you terminate the activity, terminate the application, then it loses that transient data. Whereas on iOS, Windows, and OS 10, it doesn't, okay? So I'm going to take a look at this, show you this helper here real quick. So this helper was created by Daniel Spinneretto, and I probably said his name wrong. I apologize. What it does is it's a class helper for TCustomForm. And how it works is it introduces a SaveFormState and a LoadFormState to the form. And so here's an example application. All you have to do is either call LoadFormState on the constructor or in SaveFormState on the SaveState event handler, and it will go through all the controls in the form and persist them with JSON. Okay, so I tried this out. It seems to work. I'll show you an example of it real quick. You may want to change the behavior slightly, or you may be happy with the way it works, but I'll show you this how it works here on Windows. So put Jim McKeeth, and we'll say Android is my preferred OS. Close it, relaunch it, and there we go. It's persist all the data just with 2 lines of code. So the default, since we didn't change the default storage location, is the temp directory. Here's right here. So this was the first application I showed you here. We can take a look at the data here, and we can see it's just storing it out there with binary separators. Here is the one that is using the helper. It's in JSON, you can see here. So one thing you'll notice here is group box 1, the data was your preferred OS. This wasn't something I typed in. So this is going to persist the data that's already there as well as the data the user's input. So again, you may need to tweak this or make some slight modifications to it. Essentially, this is a nice utility you could take advantage of, and definitely shows you some ways you could be more efficient with this. Okay, so here's the default, like I said, default storage location on Windows. Let's take a look at this on some other platforms. So here's the helper version of the app running on Nexus under Marshmallow. I'm going to put my name in here, Jim McKeeth, preferred OS, Android, and I'm going to tap the home button here and then launch it again, and we see that my data is still here. Now at this point, the activity never left memory, okay? It was still running in the background. If I come out here and swipe to dismiss it and launch it again, we see now relaunch, we saw a splash screen, but my data is not here. Now the reason my data is not here is because I terminated the app. On Android, if you terminate the app, you lose the data. Now, so the way I can test this is I can go into developer options. So settings, developer options, down here at the bottom, it says don't keep activities, or right here in the middle of the screen. You scroll down to the bottom, it's almost at the bottom. Yeah, it's the very bottom of the scroll. Turn this on. And so what this does is this causes the activity to be destroyed as soon as your user leaves it, which then triggers the OS's persistence to persist that. Okay, so now we'll come back here. We see again, we got the splash screen, but my data's here. Okay, so the save state event fired, and the data is persisted. If I do hit the back button from here, for example, though, that terminates the app. So if I bring up SaveState again, we see that it's lost it. But with that, I put my names backwards. You'd think I know my own name. With the setting here, though, in settings, switching over here, switching back, splash screen relaunches the app, restores from SaveState. All right, iOS, Android, or iPad here. So I launched it. You saw the splash screen. Just put my name in here. Jim. Last name McKeeth. Preferred OS. We'll say iOS this time because, hey, I got lots of devices. I can prefer all of them. Come out. If I tap to launch it again, notice we didn't get the splash screen. Okay, so it was still in memory at that point. But if I double tap on the home screen or the home button and then swipe to dismiss and then come back here and we launched it again, we saw the splash screen and the data is persisted. Okay, so this one, iOS, it does persist it even if you do terminate it. But then if you are leaving the app in the background and it gets pushed out of the memory, which happens to me all the time on my iPad, it restores it and keeps the state there for you. So very, very useful, very handy on the iPad. Here it is running on OS 10, Jim McKeeth, and we'll say OS 10 just to make OS 10 happy. And we launched again. And there it is, restored my state, persisted it for me. If you want to find out where it's located at in here, just check out where the file is stored at. It's shared location. Check out the help docs for Git temp path, and you can see exactly where the file is stored and take a look at it. A few usage considerations to keep in mind. You always want to check for an empty stream before reading from it, and clear the stream before writing to it. Otherwise, you'll keep appending to the stream and only reading out the original data, which won't be productive. Use the T-binary reader and T-binary writer to read and write from the stream. And I would suggest writing a version number as the first value in the stream. And that way you can test for compatibility when reading. So in the future, if you make a revision to your form and you've completely changed the way you're persisting it, you can determine if the data that's persisted is going to be compatible or not. You could either throw the data out if it's not compatible or create a migration path to read in existing data. To minimize incompatibilities, if you add new values to the end of the stream and avoid removing values, so let's say you take a control off your form, you can always write an empty value each time for that, and then it won't rearrange things. If you're not rearranging things, then it should remain compatible. Or you could consider using JSON, like the helper class I showed you uses, in order to make data storage more robust. A security note, don't persist sensitive information. If you have a credit card entry field on your form, don't persist that, especially on Windows and OS 10 because it's stored to a shared location and could be accessible in ways you aren't expecting. Also, if you're using the default transient location, keep in mind that the OS may clear that, and don't persist excessive amounts of data. Now, you're probably going to ask, what is excessive amounts of data? I couldn't find any hard, fast rules on that, but generally speaking, persisting text and numbers is fine, small amounts. If you're persisting a image or video or audio recording, that could take a while, especially on a mobile device where the OS may be pushing the app out of memory. If you take too long to persist, not only is it going to create a poor experience for the user, but the OS might say, oh, you're not responding and kill you. So keep that in mind. Only persist the minimum. If it's something more than that, you might want to save it ahead of time so that it's already saved. So for example, if they took a picture, save the picture to persist to temporary storage. And then later you don't have to do that during the OnSaveState. For more information, take a look at these links here. All of them are available from the blog notes link down at the bottom, embt.co/sprint-savestate. That's the most important link you need there. The link in the middle, though, the Forms SaveState helper, that's the Danielle's link that has the SaveState helper. I showed you. That's very useful. So next time, Al Manarino is going to talk about cryptography with app tethering, encrypting and decrypting the data that's being sent over app tethering. Generally, it's not necessary, but some people want to be able to do that. And so if you're interested in that, take a look at this skill sprint. Again, the Tuesday skill sprint on the 19th will be in Delphi. The Thursday skill sprint on the 21st will be in C++. All times are based on San Francisco time, so check timeanddate.com and make sure the time zones are correct, as they've been known to change. Give me a brief moment to tell you about this limited time special offer. All 10 Seattle registered users get the bonus pack, which includes the new Object Pascal Handbook by Marco Cantu. This essential language reference is a modern language guide that includes new features of the language and the core runtime library, a must-have for any Delphi developer. Also get the Binder Converter Basic. It handles the heavy lifting when converting existing VCL applications into FireMonkey applications, so you can start taking advantage of multi-device development right away. And the Premium Style Pack includes premium styles for VCL and FireMonkey to make your application look great on every platform. For more information on these special offers, or to find out what the current offers are, please visit www.embarcadero.com/radoffer. Thank you so much for joining us today for this skill sprint. And now it's time for Q&A.
Okay. Jim's here to help answer your questions.
Hey, Jim. David, I here.
Hello. So there's a few questions that came in here. One of them here, I'll go ahead and I answered some of these, and I'll answer the rest of them as we go. The question is, how would you use this for a multi-form application? So if your application had multiple forms. So if you recall when I showed you the file names in the temp folder on Windows that are being persisted, the file name had the form name in it, and actually the form name twice. What happens is the file name is based on the form name. And so if you have multiple forms in your application, there would be multiple files, each file representing a different form in your application. If you change that property, the name property, then that would result in a additional file. So for example, let's say you had one form and you used the helper I showed you, the class helper I showed you, to persist the settings of all the forms, and then you change the name to another value, let's say extra or my special data or whatever you want to call it. You could then persist additional data to that, and if you went and looked at the temp folder, there would be two different files. One file that would be all the form settings, and another file that would be the additional stuff you stored when you change the name. So yeah, that's how it works. Is the name by default is the one I showed you, and it's based on the form name, and then you can change the name to have additional storage locations. So Robert's asking why this similar capability isn't provided for VCL applications. The reason is, so you could, in 2 more lines of code, write this in VCL. All it is doing is saving the memory stream to disk as a text file in the temp folder. Not that complicated, but the reason this is built into FireMonkey is because of the way things happen on mobile devices, where Android and iOS apps can be pushed out of memory when they're in the background. So that's why it's built in to FireMonkey, and it's specifically built the way it is because on Android there is an event called OnSaveState, where if you're using the JDK or the Android development tools, the Java-based tools, you have to persist all of your data into the bundle that is part of the activity. Okay, so on Android, this is using that mechanism, the Android mechanism, to persist your form information into that bundle. So it's leveraging that functionality on Android, but then if you're doing a VCL application on Windows, you could just spin it out to the temp folder or someplace else, just as like it does on Windows. So yeah, it's not built into Windows, or not built into VCL. It's only built into FireMonkey because of the fact that it is needed on mobile applications, and it's modeled on the functionality based on Android. So Alf asked if you had an application that had a lot of data, like local data or something like that, and was displaying to the user, would you, or could you persist the query? And then use that to display the data to the user. So let's say the user's browsing through some data and they're at a certain screen with some data, and then they restart the app, or they go out of the app and come back, and the app gets pushed out of memory. Yeah, you could use that query. Just reload the query. You could even keep track of the score or the scroll location or something like that in the grid in order to display, keep the location about the same. Now, I've seen a lot of apps, especially on iOS, because iOS does that crazy thing where it screenshots your app, and then when your app relaunches, it displays the screenshot and then fades into your app again if it got pushed out. So frequently I'll see that apps do that, and they're not exactly the same because, you scroll a little bit differently, or maybe the data's changed in the background because it's pulling it from remote server or something like that. So you do the best you can in order to keep it the same state, the same user experience, but the reality is sometimes it does change because of extenuating circumstances. Alf also asked writing the version information as the first data in it, which is what I suggested doing, because if you do, let's say, delete some fields that are being written out, then you would create incompatible save state next time. So either make sure you don't do that, or, like I suggested, have the very first value you write be a version number of the save state so that you know if it's compatible. So Chris asked if it's better to use save state or write the data using load save explicitly as part of the application logic. So the original, you could, as soon as the user makes any change, just write it out, spin it out to disks, persist it, as soon as they type data on the form, for example. But then you would have a whole lot of extra disk writes. Every time the user was, or memory writes, every time the user was making a change, you'd be persisting it. So we'd use additional resources and slow the application down a little bit. In the grand scheme of things, probably not that much more resources or that much more of a slowdown. Then the next step would be, you could say, okay, every time the user leaves a field, we're going to persist it. Every time the user leaves the application, every time they switch out of the application, we're going to persist it. Or every time the user switches off the form, we're going to persist it. All of those would work or produce the right results, but again, you'd be using additional resources you just don't need, because it's not necessary to persist it at that point. So the advantage of the OnSaveState event is it occurs at the correct time that you would need to persist it. So either right before the application is closing or right before the application is being pushed out of memory. So if you want to use the minimum impact on the system, that's the event to use. I guess it's not a solution for scoring high score data of a game. Any recommendations on how best this should be done for mobile devices? So you could use this to persist the high score data for a game. I probably would. You could do that. So it really comes down to, do you want to share that high score data between all users of your app or just the local users? If it's just going to be used by the local users, you could use this. There's no reason that says you couldn't. They could just persist the, instead of persisting, what they typed in, you just persist the score data. And then instead of using the transient location, the default location, which could get wiped, instead you would use the documents path or something along those lines as far as the storage location. So you could do it that way. If you don't want to use this, you could just write it out to a stream in the documents folder anyway and store it that way. Or you could, that'll be the easiest. I mean, just put it in a stream and persist it using JSON or something like that. There's 100 different ways you could do it. It really comes down to what you're more comfortable with. I would probably use JSON just because it's easy to work with the new JSON libraries and fairly robust to deal with. But then, yeah, that would be the way I would do it. So there's lots of ways you could do it, but whatever works best for you, whatever you're most comfortable with, would be the way. If you really wanted to, you could use an INI file. They're easy to work with. It's just a text file, and you'd be done with it. So, okay, if there's any other questions, go ahead and put them in the question panel in the GoToWebinar software, and I'll get them answered for you. Originally, the skill sprint, I when I wrote the title up, I thought it was only for iOS or Android, but as you see, it works on Windows and OS X as well. So a lot more flexible, which I think is beautiful about FireMonkey, is that it makes it really flexible and easy to do your application development across multiple devices. Alf saying that streaming is also nice for storing data in general, also in VCL uses it a lot. Yes, the VCL is built on top of this concept of streaming, so you're doing the exact same thing as a VCL. You could, if you wanted to, stream out your entire form to persist it. Actually, long ago, I built was working on a database application that had the ability to, an admin user could come in and change the UI. They could move controls around. They could change the way controls looked, resize controls, etc. And then they would then take and stream the form back into the database, and then coming back out, and actually would just stream the difference. But anyway, yeah. And Al said it's not restricted to just forms. You can use it for anything. That's true. You can stream whatever you want to. It's great for database storage. Any data, like a tree, could be stored this way. Exactly. Yep. Anything you want to, you can store with streaming. Very, very flexible, very powerful. The cool thing about the way the RTL lets you work with streams, it makes it really easy. You don't have to think about, pointers and all this stuff. You just use the stream, use the T binary writer and reader, and you're just reading and writing data from the stream, and then you persist the stream. So very cool, very easy to work with. Is it a good way to check a DataSnap server status? Probably for DataSnap server status, you probably just want to call the DataSnap server and ask it what its status is, and then have it return probably a REST request, and it just return a JSON that has the status in it or something along those lines. But if you wanted to, you could. If you had a lot of data you want to return, you could use streaming, although a REST response that would probably be more logical. So anyway, there's the link to the helper application I showed, and that will have, as an example in it, you can take a look at. Again, when you run it on Android, if you terminate it, it won't save the state. But if you either change the storage path or let it get pushed out by that setting I showed, then it will save the state. That's just the way Android works. So there's a question here if you could do the same thing on VCL, or if there's a save state for VCL. There isn't a save state for VCL. The save state is specifically designed around the behavior you see on mobile devices where apps in the background get pushed out. So since VCL is for Windows and not for mobile, there's no reason to specifically do this on Windows. But at its core, the save state is just a memory stream that gets saved to disk based on a specific file name in the temp folder. That's like 3 lines of code in Delphi. You create your memory stream and then persist it to disk, and so it's not that hard to do it yourself. So there's a question here if there's any caveats in the save state event, like displaying confirmation dialogues. So I couldn't find anything specifically that said don't spend more than X milliseconds in the save state, or don't write more than Y amount of data to the Android intent. But I would say don't do anything that's going to take any significant amount of time. Don't display a confirmation dialog. Keep in mind that when the save state event fires on Android or iOS, your app is in the background. So if you display a confirmation dialog, no one's going to see it. Your app doesn't have the user's attention. It's in the background. You can't say, bring me to front. It's hidden. Second of all, your app is being pushed out of memory. If it takes too long, the OS might just say, forget it, and terminate you. I couldn't find, I tried, it seemed like I remember seeing that someplace there was a time limit for that. I couldn't find it, but anyway, don't take too much time in that event because you may get terminated before it gets finished. So the question here, does it mean it's not possible to save data on Android with SaveState? We just have to flush data into an INI-like file and read it on launch all programmatically? So you can still save data in any other way, Steve. You could save it to a local database. You could save it to a remote database. You could save it to a local text file. You could save it to JSON, XML, plain text, binary, whatever you want to do. You still have access to the Android file system. You can write inside your apps protected folder. You can write to the shared folders. Lots of places you can persist data to save data. SaveState is just designed for that instant when your app's being pushed out of memory, so you can persist your app state so that it can restore that immediately when restored when the user comes back into your application again. So it's just another of many options for saving data. Question here, does SaveState need a special permission? No, it doesn't need any special permission. By default, your app's able to write to its specified storage location, which is where if you do the change the storage path to, like, for example, your document path, that's within your app's normal permissions. Now, if you want to have the SaveState saved to the external SD card, that would require a special permission. So if you change that storage path to someplace else, then you would need a permission for that. Otherwise, you don't need any permissions for that because of the fact that it's part of the default permissions your app has. I think that's it for the questions. If there are any other questions, go ahead and put them in the question panel and go to webinar, and I'll get them answered for you. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us. And if you are interested in some of the other topics, we have lots more great skill trends coming up. Next week is the app tethering cryptography, and what is it after that? We have practical data compression, developing REST servers, animations and effects, so if-defs for cross-platform development. Lots of fun topics coming up this quarter, and even more great topics next quarter. So tell your friends, and we'll see you next time.